it's saying is, and what it's saying is that people have triggers, and what happens from the triggers is something called inferential confusion, which means that people are leaving their senses and the reality that they know, and they're going into the imagination. And in the imagination, we create obsessional doubts. And from there, that's where the OCD cycle really develops. And the idea with I-CBT is that if we eliminate the obsessional doubt, then the rest of the OCD cycle actually can't even happen. So the consequences, anxiety, and compulsions can't even happen. So if we start and we intervene earlier on in the cycle, then somebody doesn't have to experience the rest of the OCD cycle.
To piggyback on what Stephanie's saying, with our typical treatments for OCD, exposure and response prevention, in that treatment, we're looking at the intrusive thought and we're using that as the prompt. We're saying, hey, here's an intrusive thought. The prompt is this intrusive thought has extra meaning. And so I'm going to do those compulsions. And that's what we're looking at with ERP. With I-CBT, we're like, you know what, that intrusive thought actually has something going on before it. And we're going to look at that obsessional doubt, where that place where prior learning is actually what's activating it. So the example, if you look at the I-CBT website, you're going to notice one about touching doorknobs. If is this door locked? And I-CBT is like, what if the door is not locked? It's going to look at the prior learning of, why do I think this door is not locked? And then we're going to do some work there of seeing the reasoning and start tearing apart some things.
And just adding on to what Karen said, we're also looking at, why are we distrusting our senses? So I've seen the bolt on the lock slide in. I watched my hand do it. I felt my hand do it. I heard the deadbolt slide in. What's the reason that I'm ignoring my senses when in other situations I'm not ignoring my senses and I trust my senses?
Yeah, I want to add to that too, if possible. And I think the thing that really interested me and was kind of like that shift there compared to ERP, in I-CBT, we're looking at the content to look at the reasoning process and to discover how that's impacting the client, specifically related to that core self or vulnerable self theme. Whereas ERP might say intrusions are meaningless, and it's based on the person's feeling related to the intrusion versus the faulty reasoning or inference being made about the probability or likelihood of that thought.
I really appreciate what everyone has said so far about the importance of looking at sequence and what happens before doubt. I think that sequences become part of treatment in I-CBT. And as you just alluded to, Rebecca, we're also looking at what happens, what's going on below the surface. Like, what is the underlying sense of self that might be fueling this obsessional sequence? So we're looking at what happens before and what is happening below. And so it really is it's a comprehensive treatment that ultimately leads to a person being able to trust themselves again, or in some cases, some people might experience it as trusting themselves for the first time, depending on how much OCD has been governing their life and their ability to make decisions.
Well, and that's one thing that I really appreciate so far as I-CBT newbie, is that it's rebuilding that trust in, people's selves, because OCD often just makes sufferers just feel very unfamiliar with who they are, or just not feel like they just lose all sense of self and self-trust. And so kind of rebuilding that confidence, I think, is so integral in therapy. So thank you guys so much. I appreciate it. Kind of bouncing off of that a bit, how would you say, because with ERP therapy, we talk a lot about uncertainty and accepting uncertainty. How does I-CBT navigate or approach uncertainty?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are things that are part of the human experience that will always be uncertain. I don't know down to the minute how my day will go tomorrow. But there is a functional certainty that we're trying to return to with I-CBT treatment. We're not saying that that we can see exactly the future, that there will never be any doubt about things that are part of the human experience. But sometimes people that are struggling with OCD, I think are told like, well, living with uncertainty is going to be part of your life, an intense kind of uncertainty that people without OCD aren't asked to tolerate. And so we're not trying to give someone superhuman sense of certainty, but really restore the kind of functional certainty that people without OCD have in their daily lives. Being able to trust senses and go, okay, well, I may not know how my day will go tomorrow minute by minute, but in this moment, I can trust that this door is locked. Or I may not know what my life will look like 5 years from now, but I can trust that I'm not a pedophile. And these are the reasons why.
Thank you so much, Megan. All right, we have a question from Bruce here. I will allow Bruce to talk. All right. Hi, Bruce.
Can you see me?
Oh, I can't see you. I think I'm allowing you to talk, but I can make you visible.
Okay.
Thank.
All right. Okay. You can hear me. So
Go ahead and ask your question. Sorry,
yeah,
Bruce.
okay.
I don't know how to make you visible.
So what do you all do if I-CBT doesn't work at some point and it just doesn't work? What do you do then? Or you just kind of go back to the modules and keep going, or
I
Well-
think, oh, you want to go, Stephanie?
So first of all, I think all of us would acknowledge that there is no single treatment for OCD that works for everybody. And you know, I-CBT is, an evidence-based treatment, but it doesn't fix everyone. We would love it if any treatment was universal. I think it really is an individual situation where people get stuck. I have some patients where cognitively they're just not going to be capable of handling I-CBT. And I've had to do 1 or 2 modules before I've really realized, you know what, this just isn't for them. This is just not something that they're going to be able to comprehend. And then we shift to something else. And that's one of the beautiful things about having multiple tools in your tool belt, where you can turn around and say, you know what, this modality isn't going to be great for somebody. Let me use one of the other evidence-based treatments that I know. And luckily for OCD, we do have multiple evidence-based treatments.
But okay, Stephanie, what about somebody that is at the cognitive level to do it and it doesn't work? What do you do then?
Again, I think it really depends on the individual situation. Sometimes it's going to be going back and redoing some of the modules. I think it has to do a little bit with figuring out, where their inferential confusion is, figuring out where they're getting tripped up, and where they are, what is still taking them into the imagination.
Okay.
Maybe I can add on to that a little bit
Good,
too,
yeah.
to clarify there too, because a couple things I've noticed, especially while learning, if the clinician is new, and I'll say like we were all new at some point, there's a sense of sometimes wanting to rescue the client or getting really excited about knowing where it's leading. I think that's one thing to assess, like on your own level, am I moving through the modules too quickly for this person? Are they not meeting what we call like the training card standards for passing to the next module? Is there a lack of understanding? Did we not discover what the primary doubt was? Or are we not getting to like the crux of what is really going on here? Is there like client doubting of the model itself? Are they like reluctant to get started or even do the homework outside of session? Like maybe they're understanding in the session, but outside of it, they're not really doing as much as you might be excited for them to do, because there is a lot of work up front to understand the foundation. And the process, the cognitive process of how we think about intrusive thoughts and compulsions. Those are a couple of things I noticed. And then even the belief itself, really buying into the fact that, for example, like ruminating or doing the compulsion really is doing something. And so they're going back to, I think as Stephanie said, that inferential confusion piece, or even the thinking about the thinking can be really helpful.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Bruce, I would also add on, if you've gone through the modules and the clients really bought into the treatment and they've grown their insight and they have resolved their inferential confusion, wonderful. Like we've met the goals of the therapy. If we haven't, we're going to really look at that person in front of us and their values and cultural considerations, their treatment experiences. We're going to look at their readiness for change. And then we're going to say, you know what? We did a cognitive treatment. That's what I-CBT is. And what are we missing? What have we learned? What are your strengths? Is there a skill that needs to be built up before we go back through the modules? Or maybe we might shift to more of a behavioral approach or an attention training approach or a metacognitive approach. So I think it depends on all those factors as to what direction I might go in.
And I'll add that everyone told me when I started doing I-CBT, and I've been doing it for almost 2 years now, everyone told me you need to slow down, you need to slow down, you need to slow down. And the more I slow down, the better it is, and the more it works with patients. I think when I started out, I had this idea in my mind that I needed to get through one module in every session and then move on. And oh my goodness, I'm so glad that I'm not thinking that way anymore because it wasn't working for my patients and it wasn't working for me. So I think slowing the process down and not trying to rush through it, especially the first 4 modules.
Great answers. Great answers. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We appreciate it. So
Yeah.
yeah, if anybody would like to ask a question out loud, if you raise your hand, I can let you talk. Otherwise, please feel free to write out the questions in the Q&A as well. Okay, so we have another question here from Melissa. She asked, could you provide some examples of how I-CBT might be applied to perfectionism OCD? Example, perfectionism with work or school assignments. Thank you.
I would love Karen to answer this one. And I say that because Karen, aside from being a wonderful therapist, she specializes in working with kids, and she's done a lot of work with I-CBT and kiddos. So I nominate Karen for this one.
Oh, you're so sweet. So I-CBT treats inferential confusion, not perfectionism. And I think, Melissa, to answer your question, we'd really have to assess that perfectionism, because that might, so this is the way I think about it. I use my hands a lot, but I-CBT, we're thinking about a sequence to understand the process of inferential confusion. Perfectionism might actually be on top of it. So we might have to treat the perfectionism separately, unless the perfectionism is in the inferential confusion based on a story, so the OCD narrative. So I know I'm giving you a wordy answer, and I wish I could be super simple here, but I'd have to know more about the perfectionism. And this is where a really good assessment comes in, because perfectionism might look like just right OCD. Perfectionism might look like vulnerable self, like I could be an irresponsible person, which then that's a doubt, and that doubt can help me with inferential confusion, and then I-CBT might play out. So I'm giving you a lot of words, but I want to say your question's complicated. Would you guys want to add on? Did I miss something there?
What I would throw out, and I totally agree with what you're saying, Karen. You know, when we look at the obsessional doubt, and Teresa Chu created a great visual that I'm appreciative of, an iceberg showing the things that contribute to the obsessional doubt. And one of them is what we call the vulnerable self theme, which is what OCD tells us we could become if we don't engage in the compulsions. And when you combine that with, you know, with the narratives that we've told ourselves about who we are, and we're listening to those things, and we combine that with inferential confusion, we combine that with previous experiences, societal norms and rules, that all adding up together is going to result in what the obsessional doubt is. And so if somebody is worried, if somebody, they're really concerned about doing well and being high achieving, and their vulnerable self theme is, I may be negligent or I may disappoint other people. Well, that's something we can, and the story that they're telling themselves if I don't do this perfectly, I'm going to be unloved, or people won't want to be around me, or people won't trust me, or people won't respect me. We can absolutely address that through looking at an alternate story, the idea of what are your senses actually telling you that people are thinking. What do you actually think about yourself? What are your actions telling you that you actually are, through the real self? So I agree with Karen, it's a complicated answer, but hopefully that's gives you a little.
I will say with perfectionism, OCD, sometimes exposure and response prevention seems like it makes a lot of sense of like, I'm really focused on, I have to read every single word, otherwise I won't know enough for my test. So we might think about exposures and what they would look like we might skim it, we might not know everything. I-CBT will definitely come at it from a little bit of a different direction. So I think if we know a little bit more about the perfectionism, we could give you a little bit clearer idea of what it looks like. But it's not about doing the exposures. It's about treating the inferential confusion that's really getting wrapped up in why this perfectionism is around in the first place.
Thank you guys so much. I would like to move on to Gray's question here. I've read that traditional CBT may end up validating the obsessions and potentially heightening the OCD symptoms. Can you explain how I-CBT is different? Is it trying to figure out the line where senses spiral to irrational self-doubt?
I can say something about the validation piece, because there is a part of I-CBT that works in validation, though it's not validation of the reasoning that leads to the obsessional doubt, or like how logical that is. There's a validation of the client's experience, and what is happening for them, that there's a reasoning process that has built up a really scary story about what this person could become, and why they need to do their compulsions, which is different. Validating a person's experience and validating how the scary story got built up is different from validating that the obsession itself has weight, carries weight, or it needs to be acted on in the here and now. There are modules of I-CBT that say OCD is 100% imaginary and 100% irrelevant. And so then that can feel like a real shock to clients and can feel really uncomfortable, I think, and requires a clinician to really tread lightly with respect for the person's experience. But first we do say, yeah, it makes sense. There's something that makes sense about how you got to this place. But that is different from saying that the obsession is something that really needs to be acted on and lived by. So I'll stop there and maybe let others pick up with the answering of the rest of the question.
One of the things that like traditional appraisal model does, which is different than I-CBT, and this took me a while to actually understand, but if one side we've got reality and the other side we have the OCD bubble or the imagination, the idea is that a traditional appraisal model is using logic to get out of the bubble. And when you use logic to get out of the bubble, that's really, really difficult because you've already been immersed in the imagination. I often give the example, I have a wonderful 5-year-old nephew who I love with all of my heart. If I showed him a pen and I said, James, what is this? He would go, well, that's a pen. And if I went, no, it's actually a magic wand. And we spend the next hour doing spells and, torturing his sister and stuff like that. At the end of that hour, if I turn around to him and I go, hey, James, what's this? And he goes, well, it's a magic wand. If I turn around and I go, no, it's not, it's a pen. What's his response going to be? Well, he's going to throw a major, major tantrum because he has now spent an hour, which in the world of a 5-year-old is a lifetime, in his imagination. So it's not that he's stupid. It's not that he doesn't know that it's a pen. And if I hand it to him, he can still write his name out, but he's lived in that imagination. So pulling him out of that is going to be really, really difficult. With I-CBT, we're in reality and we're using logic and facts to stay in reality. So we're not saying, oh, we need to come out of it. We're using the logic to never go into the imagination. And that was something that took me a while to really comprehend.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I think it's also worth saying too, you don't even begin to really speak about and intervene on the imagination until module 5. And even at that point, you're not delving too deeply or arguing with the client, whether about content or values, but getting them to understand that it's generated from within, like in that mind's eye versus with their actual eyes.
Wow, this is all such fascinating stuff. Oh my gosh. All right, we have another question here. I think I might have OCD related to my fear that I'm a bad therapist. I usually describe it as imposter syndrome. Have you ever seen this as a presentation of OCD?
I have to say, this is such a great question. Because I had this exact conversation with somebody less than a week ago. And I said, what if you conceptualized imposter syndrome through an I-CBT lens? And this was actually like a full conversation that we had. And it's a really interesting idea because this person can turn around and go, well, I have the facts. I've had really good training. I've had good supervision. I have good patient outcomes. I know that I care about my patients. So we've covered the real self. We've covered internal sense data. We've covered common sense. They can see their patients reacting. They can see them getting better. So they're ignoring all of those things. And the person just turned around and went, this is a totally different way of conceptualizing imposter syndrome. And I went, yes, absolutely. So do I think imposter syndrome in and of itself is OCD? No, I think that, it can be part of, a vulnerable self theme about, negligence or perfectionism, carelessness, things like that. But the inferential confusion that we're talking about, inferential confusion exists outside of OCD. And, we talk about it through an I-CBT lens and we're talking about it through an OCD lens, but it exists outside of that. But yeah, it's so funny that you bring that up because it's legitimately a conversation I had a few days ago with another OCD therapist.
It also goes to the anxiety that we feel when we do growth, right? Imposter syndrome. I'm anxious. Am I good enough? Is this the right treatment for someone? Did I miss something? Am I overly responsible for people's well-being? It really does pull at a lot of these themes. And what do we do? So we have to break it down a little bit to understand, is this anxiety or is this a belief problem? I-CBT is a belief disorder. Anxiety disorders are based on anxiety or phobic reaction. That's a very Mike Hetty. If you don't know Mike Hetty, that's a very Mike Hetty statement right there. But we do want to look at that. Just because I feel anxiety, where's it coming from? You want to know that person. You want to know your story, anonymous attendee. But it does have it. And here's a little fun fact. I like to read dissertations of doctoral students who do I-CBT work. And sometimes it's in French, so I like to do this. But when they looked at parents and they gave the inferential confusion questionnaire to parents of children who had OCD, the parents didn't necessarily have OCD, but they scored high on inferential confusion. we can have inferential confusion outside of OCD, but I-CBT treats inferential confusion. If you do not have inferential confusion, I-CBT is not the right treatment for you.
Which is exactly why we're not using I-CBT for phobic responses. Because that's, as Karen said, there's no inferential confusion there, and that's specifically what I-CBT is targeting.
One thing I'll say, and I would like to hear everyone else's opinion on the panel too. One module I've noticed, and not even necessarily doing it from the I-CBT perspective, but that real self module has been like life-changing for some of my clients to actually work through that and then go back and add the qualities, especially in like a general kind of like boring day, the things people do, and going back and noticing, okay, what quality did I bring to my day? I woke up, I ate breakfast, I went to work, I said hi to an employee, I made a joke. But there are so many qualities involved in that: discipline, commitment to routine, self-care, kindness, consideration. So things like that I've noticed can really click with people and shift the way that they're thinking about themselves, even in those mundane moments. So whether or not that is OCD itself, I haven't necessarily seen a therapist show up with that particular theme, but I found that really helpful.
OCD is like getting dressed up for the Oscars, right? Like it takes a lot of time. You look great, but you're uncomfortable and you really can't do your everyday stuff. But life is wearing sweatpants and doing all those little things where the value is. And what Rebecca's describing is sometimes we have to look a little closer at all the stuff and all the values we do throughout the day. And that's really valuable. It's embedded in there, isn't it?
I love all that. That's wonderful. I'm curious, in this kind of vein, like how do you balance sort of like validating somebody's like, true self, but without kind of getting into the weeds of reassurance seeking?
That's a good question.
Well, first of all, there's a difference between reassurance seeking in and of itself is not a bad thing. And I'm taking that from Carl Robbins. But the idea of turning around to somebody and helping them develop confidence in something, people may need to hear things more than one time. That's okay. It doesn't necessarily have to be a problem to give somebody reassurance in a situation. With compulsions, what we're saying is, how is this interfering in your life? How is this taking away from your life? Sometimes people need to hear things a couple of times. Sometimes people need a reminder of things. That's okay. Where do you draw that exact line between a pep talk and reassurance seeking? Like, again, do we actually care about the actual technicality of the line, or do we care about the functionality of it? We care about the functionality. As Karen said, we want to be living values-based lives. And if somebody has to turn around and say, a few times, you know what, I really agree with you. I think you're making the right decision. Okay, yeah, all right. I feel a little bit better about that. Okay, that's fine. But I don't think reassurance in and of itself has to be this awful thing that we must avoid.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Reassurance has that urgency. So when reassurance becomes the compulsion, it has the urgency. We dismiss our senses, we step over them, and we go straight to, there's something that I need to find out. And that feels very different than just learning or saying, hey, I needed to collect more information. So, right, we don't want to label every reassurance as compulsive, but we do want to look for the functionality, like where's their urgency? What is the urgency? Why am I stepping over what I already know? And this goes back to what Megan was talking about, right? I already had sense data, but I just catapulted over it. And we want to find out a little bit more about that, what's going on there.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and drawing a thread there too, more broadly, I think the book points this out too. It's important when you're teaching clients during that intervention stage not to use their senses in an obsessional way, not to, for example, like overlook or quickly avoid looking because, oh, like I looked, that's my senses. So it really does matter what everyone is saying, like function and context and even the intention for the behavior.
and
We're
love it.
we're trying to get back to effortless.
Yeah.
Erin, I think in your original question, you made a connection between assurance and discovering the real self. And I mean, the process of helping a client establish for themselves or rediscover or recognize like what is their real self doesn't happen through those knee-jerk reactions. It doesn't happen with a sense of urgency. It's a process, and it's not the therapist who is telling the client who they really are. I completely agree with what Stephanie was saying about assurance. Like, people need encouragement in this process, and if that takes the form of what might traditionally be called assurance, I think that's okay. But really, the real self is something that the client needs to articulate for themselves, with the therapist supporting them in that process. And built into I-CBT modules, and then all the creativity that is in this I-CBT community, there are a lot of wonderful ways that we can guide clients through that process of articulating what is their real self. I think too, it's something that has to be discovered through living. And after a person has made their way through the modules or has gotten to a certain point in treatment, they may experience what is called the void. Like, after they have left the OCD bubble and before maybe their real self is like taken root, or before they're really able to say, this is who I am. I'm not that, but like, who am I really? There can be a void. And that is, that can be a hard place to be in. But slowing down, as we've already said, is a big part of I-CBT treatment. And slowing down to discover the real self will ultimately lead to something much richer than what would come from a real self with just knee-jerk reactions and brief statements to assure the client.
And Megan, what you just said, which is such an important point, we're not, as therapists, telling the patient who they are. We're not convincing them of a story. We're not convincing them of who they are. We're helping them discover it for themselves, because it's useless for us to tell somebody something that's not going to be helpful. Helping them discover it on their own, helping them see an alternate story, helping them see the real self is really the value. So yeah, Megan, I agree. I think that's such an important point.
That's wonderful. Thank you guys so much. I know we've all experienced as therapists when we have a client who just thinks of themselves as this horrible, awful person. And we're just like, no, you're so wonderful. Like, that's the story. Don't let the OCD fool you in this. So yeah, thank you. Those are all wonderful responses. We have one question here. How do you apply I-CBT with clients who struggle with images such as sexual inappropriate behaviors or harm to others, etc.?
I have experience working with clients with that, with those particular images. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that images in I-CBT can still be doubts. They can be just a visual representation in one's mind's eye of something that is actually a doubt. And so without knowing, a particular client with those thoughts, I think that slowing down can still be a really helpful process to understand, like, what is happening before that image, before that thought that may have an image associated with it. It might be disturbing, it might be really graphic, but no matter the intensity of the image, it can still represent a doubt, just like a doubt, maybe I left the door unlocked. And so by slowing down and walking the client back and helping them identify what happened before, we get a better sense of what that image or that thought represents for that person and where to go from there. But I'd love to hear if others have experience actually treating people with those particular thoughts.
Stephanie, do you want to go?
I'm actually trying to pull up right now a phenomenal graphic that
I know
Amanda,
exactly which one
you knew. See, the problem is Karen and I know each other well at this point, so we can kind of read each other's minds. not in a psychotic way, but in a
Well, as I was talking about images, I had the image of, I think, the image that you're going to pull up in my mind.
so I'll talk about it as I'm hunting it down, and I will find it in the next minute, I promise. The idea behind it is that images can pop up at 4 different points in the obsessional sequence. One is as a trigger itself. And there we go. I knew I'd find it. So this image was created by Amanda Petrick Gardner, who is a phenomenal therapist, and she also offers I-CBT training that is just terrific. And I've collaborated with her a number of times, and I just love it. She also has a lot of stuff on Instagram about OCD and a lot about I-CBT that's really helpful visually. So what she's showing here is that there are 4 times in the obsessional sequence when images can pop up. So one is the trigger. So the image being the trigger itself. And this is what we would historically refer to as the intrusive images. So that's happening before the doubt. An image can actually be the doubt itself. So seeing yourself doing something. So let's say I'm in the kitchen and I'm chopping up vegetables with a knife. There's no image at that point, but the obsessional doubt may show up as seeing myself stabbing my dog. So it can show up there. The consequences, it can show up there where now I'm visually seeing my dog, injured, dead, whatever. The one place that I absolutely find it really key is the compulsions, though, because what'll happen a lot of times is people will have had an image in their head before, and then they're going to replay and they're going to check their mind to see if the image came up. So did that image pop into my head? Did I have that image come up for me? And by checking that, they're actually sparking the image. So it's kind of like whatever you do, don't think about a pink elephant with white polka dots. Well, guess what you just thought about? You just had that image come up. So if you're scanning your brain for an image, you're going to generate that image. And we see that in compulsions with images coming up a lot. So when we have images with OCD and we're looking at it through an I-CBT lens, we want to figure out where in the sequence are these images actually happening. And then we can intervene because again, we're intervening at the obsessional doubt, before the obsessional doubt right there. So if the image is the compulsions or the image is the consequence, if we're targeting the obsessional doubt, we don't even need to deal with those images later on because we've broken the chain.
Images also happen to be very habitual. So sometimes when we look at this type of a handout and we realize where the images are coming. So let's say I can imagine violent and horrific car accidents, and I'm in my house. Like, I know I'm not driving at that moment, but that image feels really scary and upsetting. And then I will start to notice my vulnerable self of, I'm going to be an irresponsible mom if I get into the car, because now I've had this image and it felt scary. So I should probably avoid the car. And we start to look at the sequence. What's keeping this image so important? And what do I have to, why is inferential confusion playing a role? Well, once I start to realize, wow, and this goes back to what Rebecca and Megan were talking about with the real self, you know what? I'm not an irresponsible mom, but this image really did trigger that doubt for me. Or the doubt really triggered the image, depending on where it is in the sequence. And I know I take care of my kids and I feed them and I make their lunches. Oh, I don't actually have to go into the story where that image is. I can really see it for what it is. So there's the mind's eye, the scary movie. And now I can kind of say, oh, wait, I don't have to go on that scary movie. I know who I am. I know, yeah. So when I get in the car, I might feel a little tinge of that. What Megan was talking about, that void of like, oh, if I'm not compulsing now, what's wrong with me? Oh, wait, nothing's wrong. It's the story. Of course, the anxiety's popping a little bit, but it makes sense. I know what I'm doing, and I don't have to really feed any of the doubt.
Stephanie, where was that image from that you had pulled up?
I pulled it up from the Facebook group, but I can throw it in the chat. It's also on Amanda's Instagram. I'm not cool enough to have Instagram. My dog has an Instagram, but I'm not cool. I'm not gonna lie, but I am not cool enough to have Instagram.
How do you spell Amanda's last name? And I'll put it in the chat for everybody as well.
Oh, here, I'll throw it in right now.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
I believe that image is also on the I-CBT website.
And then Stephanie, I see that you're typing. Are you answering Gray's question there?
I was gonna answer Grace's question, but I can amazingly enough, I can't do 87 things at once. I'm not as talented as I thought I was 10 years ago. But what I was gonna say is the 12 modules are coming from the original manual. How they're described is going to be, and how they're explained is going to be slightly different depending on who's doing it. What I would really recommend is if you go to the I-CBT website, watching the free videos of the 12 modules and going through it that way. The other thing is that there are a few people who I just threw the image in the chat. There are a few people that have wonderful trainings. One is Amanda Petra Gardner, who I just mentioned. She has a wonderful training. Bronwyn Schroyer, Katie Marodi, they have a phenomenal training. Kate Goldhouse has a wonderful training. And if you go onto the I-CBT website, there's a section that says consultations and training, and you can go on there and it lists the people that are offering trainings, and they're very reasonably priced. And I really recommend doing more than one because different people explain things differently, and I think our brain just operates differently. So there are certain people like Teresa Chu. She's incredibly meta, and she's brilliant beyond brilliance. My brain doesn't comprehend the way that Teresa explains things. And there are other people who I go, oh, my brain understands that. It's not that they're not explaining it in a fabulous way. It's just my brain doesn't operate in the same fabulous way. My brain doesn't operate the way Mike Hetty's brain works. So for me, I wish my brain operated the way Mike Hetty's brain works.
I will say, when I first started learning, I was definitely lucky having a supervisor who already was well versed in I-CBT. I think Brittany offers a training that has a couple of things, but I will say, sticking with the manual itself, all the other trainings are supplemental to that. And so I think, as Stephanie said, diversity in opinion and knowledge, I think, is really helpful. Finding something that offers, like, I want to say, like, bang for the buck too. Like, the manual itself is really good. I'd say read that, read it again, and in between both of those times of reading it, read it a third time in between secretly, and find people who are well versed and willing to be humble and open to, like, dumb questions, trying to figure out how to actually do it, because it can be intimidating at first, I would say.
It's normal to get confused with your clients when you're learning I-CBT. It is really easy to say, I got this. No, I don't got this. Oh, I got it again. Because we're really learning together. And so I would agree, read Fred and Karen O'Connor's manual. And then if you like videos, listen to the videos. If you like reading, read some of the chats on the I-CBT Facebook group. Then I would say do a training go back and do a workbook, do some I-CBT work on yourself, like answer the questions. Super helpful when you answer your questions, whether you have inferential confusion or not. But it really does, it's a layered approach. So find the mediums that speak to you.
And if you're reading the manual and you find it confusing, yes, that is the answer. The answer is yes. The manual is confusing, and that's why you do have to read it a few times. Also, there are some typos and things like that in there. Overlook them. Go to the core of it. The other thing that I will say is that there are a lot of people in the I-CBT community who have lived experience. I have found I am somebody without lived experience. The people who have lived experience pick it up easier. They just do. And part of it is because the first person that they apply I-CBT to is themselves. So for me, I had to work harder than I know my colleagues did. And I don't mean that as like, oh my God, I'm so special. I mean that as in I felt clueless for longer. I felt like a doofus for longer than they did. And I had to work harder to actually figure out what the heck was going on. Totally worth it. Really glad I did. But if you don't have lived experience and you're going, I'm really struggling, call me. Call me, text me. I'm here. Been there, done that.
I'm curious, as clinicians, do you all still use ERP? And if you do, like, how do you use ERP and I-CBT together?
I do.
love. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rebecca.
Oh no, I was just saying I do personally. I think the one thing that I have found some difficulty in, and I've heard others say this, is being fairly careful. Like if you're starting to learn I-CBT, that can add to the overwhelm of trying to find like the marriage between both of those therapies. Not that they can't be, but being kind of careful about how you talk about uncertainty or exposure or response prevention, and maybe even throwing some values in there in relation to inferential confusion and the OCD sequence. But I think both can really help each other. And for me, it depends on whether or not a client is willing to try I-CBT or they really just want to go the ERP route because they read that that's the gold standard too. And that's the one that's really widely known.
I absolutely still use ERP. I think ERP is fantastic. I've had so much success over the years, and as have many, many clinicians and many patients have regained their lives from ERP. So I think ERP is wonderful. My caution with people combining the treatments, especially in the beginning, is that we're not just talking about a different way of conceptualizing treatment, we're conceptualizing the disorder differently. We're saying that, in ERP, we're saying that the OCD is coming from the intrusive thoughts. That's not what we're saying in I-CBT. So we actually have a different foundation. And Carl and I, and when people are turning around and saying, oh, well, I think I'm already doing I-CBT because I'm using these components to it. Carl and I put a metaphor together, which is I play baseball and that has a bat and it has a ball. So I also play cricket. It doesn't matter that the field is different. One has a flat bat, one has a round bat. The ball is totally different and the rules are completely different. That's what we're really talking about. We're talking about a completely different sport. And yeah, there may be one or two things where there is a similarity, but it is foundationally a different conceptualization. And so to turn around and say, okay, on this one hand, OCD is caused by intrusive thoughts, but at the same time, we're saying intrusive thoughts are not at all what's causing it. The idea of melding that together, I think, can be really confusing for people, especially at the beginning of learning I-CBT.
Right. So I will say that I am a newer clinician and did my graduate work after I'd been working in the nonprofit world for a number of years. I also came to I-CBT through my own treatment for OCD, and I have never done ERP for my own treatment and have not been trained in ERP and working with clients. Now, that said, tomorrow I am going through the IOCDS BTTI to learn ERP because I do believe in having as many tools as possible in my toolkit, as Stephanie referenced before. And of course, with my clients, I share with them, what I am equipped to help them with how I'm equipped to help them, which is right now with I-CBT. In terms of, ethics and offering treatment options, I think by offering that informed consent and helping a client understand what I'm equipped to provide, and obviously providing referrals if they want something different, I think that really helps build the rapport and give a client options. And then also, I do often come back to my own experience of going through my own treatment with I-CBT, finding it helpful, and feeling like ERP is something I know is helpful, but I also know from my own experience that I-CBT without ERP can also lead to recovery and that restored sense of trust.
I use ERP and I use ACT and I use metacognitive therapies. I use a variety and I use I-CBT. I think you make some mistakes if you try to blend them too soon, because you'll start to lean too heavily on the consequences and trying to shift behavior change when you're trying to shift a cognitive change really tends to muddy the water. So I use both. I tend to work with the people who have struggled with ERP and are looking for something different. If a child or teen is coming to me and they've already tried ERP from a really great clinician and they're like, hey, can we try something else? We'll really look at it. I-CBT is not evidence-based for children or teens, but sometimes it's warranted to try something different. And so I like having the option of what fits the client.
Wonderful, thank you. Sorry, my dog just knocked over something that just scared me. Well, I know we're almost out of time, but if I could ask one more question, just because I think it's a really important one to ask. Is it okay if we go a little bit over, you guys, or does anybody have to take off right away? Awesome. But my question was, is there anything that we need to be specifically mindful of when using I-CBT to treat diverse populations, especially like the BIPOC population or queer communities?
I would say one thing that really comes to mind, and this is more from, well, I'll just say it. So you want to be really careful not to impose your values on clients from typically marginalized or minority communities, and that being extremely careful to build the therapeutic alliance and getting buy-in and building that trust and respect before I like for any client, whether OCD or not. And I imagine it's like pretty challenging to honor someone's unique individual perspective and finding, like, parsing out what is reasonable and then where does this become obsessional, especially if it's related to maybe, for example, like real event OCD where they really did experience a trauma. So that's kind of where I'm thinking, but I'd like to hear everyone else's opinion too.
I think that's where the early modules are super important in I-CBT. Who's the person in front of us? What's the story? You have reasons of why you believe this. Let's go slow and really tease out those reasons. What are the rules in your community? What are the facts? Your facts may not be my facts in my community. Let me be able to really understand it before I start throwing in the interventions. I-CBT, the first 4 modules are actually not intervention, they're educational. And I think that's where we can, it helps us to really be respectful before we jump in too quickly with, oh, I know how to treat your OCD, let's go. That's a mistake, and it really will not serve the client well, and it won't serve your therapeutic relationship well.
Yeah, there's a reason that we don't lead with the modules that OCD is imaginary and irrelevant. There's just a reason. I love what you said, Karen, about really getting to know the client. It is important. And just because someone expresses something that on the surface may sound like an obsessional doubt doesn't mean that it is. It could be trauma. It could maybe not be trauma, but there's just a lot to explore with that client. I think that even when something is like ecologically valid and a person's experience is being honored and respected, I think there can still be places where OCD tricks get in the way of that person's ability to use their senses, even if their distrust of systems and difficult experiences they've had is real. There can still be ways to proceed, I think, with a deep respect for what the client has experienced or is experiencing.
In module 2, we talk about the logic behind OCD, and it's one of my favorite modules, and patients love it because it's so validating. Because in a lot of cases, they've been told before that their reasoning doesn't make sense, their logic doesn't make sense. And here we're actually saying, no, this absolutely makes sense. The abstract facts that you have, the societal norms, the rules, the personal experience, the hearsay, the possibility, that all makes sense. We'll get down the line to why it's irrelevant. But for right now, we can actually look at that. And depending on the theme and on the individual, different components of the logic are going to be louder for individuals. And so I find that for a lot of the people in more marginalized communities, I find that the personal experience ends up being louder. And for us, and Karen, I love how you always put this, it's about who's showing up in front of us. You know, it's what are they telling us? It's not my job to turn around and go, oh, well, all of these things should be equal. No, that's ridiculous. If this is what's loudest for you, then that's what we have to address. We have to address that this is loudest for you. And also recognizing, again, that our values may be different than our patients and our understanding of something may be different than our patients. And as much as we have to teach our patients, they have so much that they can teach us, and we can learn so much from them. And thinking that this is a one-way street was a huge mistake.
And that might even look like asking, like broaching that topic with your client, like, how is my identity showing up and how are you perceiving that? And building trust there too, opening the space up where they can really bring, especially if there's shame involved with their OCD, where they can really bring their experience to you and feel like they're going to be validated and heard.
And I think the rules category sometimes is like, so what are the rules here, right? Am I supposed to be the expert or are you the expert? Wait, how's this playing out in what you're experiencing in your OCD story, in your vulnerable self? Let's go back. Where's this giving credibility to your doubt? Absolutely.
And it can also start out very early on for us at our practice, during our first session, after we've done the intake, we present patients with treatment options and we discuss with them, and they are part of the deciding factor of what treatment modality we're going to go with. We may make suggestions, but they are leading their treatment. And that's part of, giving them that autonomy and giving them that idea of, yeah, I may know this stuff, but that doesn't mean that your voice doesn't have value to it and your opinion doesn't have a lot of value to it, because it does. And I care about what direction you want to go with your treatment because this is your life.
That's all wonderful. Thank you so much, guys. I really, really appreciate it. This was so much fun. It went by so fast. So we'll definitely have to do something like this again soon. But thank you all just for your valuable insights and knowledge. And thank you to all the attendees for coming. Really appreciate it. We'll have another webinar tomorrow evening with 3 other practitioners. But yeah, thank you all so much again for coming tonight. This video is recorded too. I'll be putting it up on our website, or if you would like it directly, I can email it to people. I did start it late. I'm so sorry. I thought I had it going and I realized I didn't. So the introductions were missed, but I can send everybody's introductions as well. So, but thank you guys again. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Erin, for organizing.
Thank you, Erin.
Thanks,
Bye.
Erin, for inviting us.
Bye, everyone.
All right,
Bye.
bye everybody. Thank you.